Hello and welcome to Radically Rethinking How We Handle Errors. My name is Elaine Lawler and I am your instructor for this webinar. Before we get started, I just want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much for joining me. This is such an important topic, and I'm really excited to share what I have to share with you in the time we have together. One thing I'm going to actually ask you to do is when you're listening to the information that I'm going to present, some of it is going to be a little bit controversial. Some of it is going to be thought-provoking, I hope. And what I would like you to do is to listen and take this in from the perspective of being the investigative reporter. Now, what's the difference here? Well, what I don't want you to do is judge what's going on, and in particular, judging either the acts of others or of yourself, because some of the information I'm sharing, you might think, oh, I do that, and maybe I shouldn't. And I don't want you to feel like you've done anything wrong if you decide that you like what I'm sharing here a little bit better than what you've done in the past. So just from that perspective, please approach all of this from curiosity and being the investigative reporter. All right, are you ready? Grab a favorite beverage and let's get going. Here's a quick overview of this webinar. First, we are going to talk about how we handle errors in the positive reinforcement world, including a very popular method, which is using a no reward marker. Next, we're going to talk about the question, why do they need to know that they're wrong? From here, we're going to look at having a handler mindset shift. This shift is going to be a shift towards asking, should we be really focused on errorless learning? Or could we be focused on errors as learning? From here, I'm going to walk you through my step-by-step process for handling errors. The objectives of this webinar are as follows. I want to offer you a new way to think about working with errors, because we're going to encounter errors everywhere we go. That's just the nature of the beast when we are training dogs, when we're doing anything really, right? So I want to offer a new way to think about errors. I want to help you understand why we need to change our strategies and tactics in training. I see this, what I'm going to be sharing, I see everywhere in training, and I think we could just take things to the next level and get much more effective results. And that's what I want for you. I want to help you to shift your mindset into a place of greater optimism in your training. Taking on this approach that I'm going to share with you just makes training so much more fun and makes everything a lot more optimistic for yourself and for your dog. And it also makes things, our training more effective, as you'll see. Finally, this webinar is really intended to help you improve your relationship with your dog, because we can always grow that relationship. No matter how good it is, we can always keep growing it. And this is going to offer you some new ways, I hope, that you can work on that as well. Okay, let's begin by taking a look at how we typically, as a community, the positive reinforcement-based community, how do we handle working with errors in general? So in the positive reinforcement world, we place considerable emphasis on reinforcing what's right. We want to look at what our dog is doing well and reinforce that. And a big important part of that is telling our dogs what we want them to do. So we set up our training, they do something that we like, and then we say, yes, we want you to do more of that, and we reinforce them, and that behavior grows. We want to keep things happy and positive for our dogs, and we put a lot of energy into helping them be right, which is wonderful. It feels great. We're all having a good time. Our dogs love it. We love it. So then we bump up against, like, what do we do when we set everything up and our dog does the behavior, does a behavior that we are asking for, but it's not the behavior that we want. And that we see as, our dog made a mistake. So when we're focusing on telling our dog what to do and reinforcing the things we want them to do, and they're doing things we don't want them to do, what do we do about that? How do we tell them, no, not that, this? Again, this is a hotly debated topic, and we are going to do a deep dive into looking at what the standard practices in our community and what I'm going to recommend you do instead. Ready? Buckle up. Here we go. Okay, so to begin, there are three main approaches that I see very commonly used in the positive reinforcement world of training. And I'm not saying this is the only thing that I see, but these are the main categories of response to errors in training. The first one is we stop. The dog makes a mistake, we stop, and then of course we don't want the dog to feel upset or think they've done something wrong, because of course we are positive trainers. So we then ask for something simple, and then we reward them for that, so that we have something we can reward them for. The next category is using the no reward marker, which I will dig into when we get to that in a minute. And then the third category of handling errors is using a low value reinforcer for when they don't do it right, and a high value reinforcer or jackpot when they do get it correct. So let's take a look at each of these in turn, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about what this strategy involves and why it might not give you the results that you think that you would expect to get. All right, so the first thing, stopping and then asking for something simple. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're doing agility and you're coming up to a jump and you have cued the dog to take the back side of the jump, but instead the dog takes the front side. So a standard strategy for handling that would be the handler just stops. The handler stops dead in their tracks and then calls the dog back to them, because we want to interrupt the behavior. They made a mistake, let's interrupt the behavior. But we don't want to punish the dog for having made a mistake. We want to give them something we can reinforce them to. So you stop dead, the dog, call the dog over, and then you ask for a hand touch. And the dog does the hand touch, and then you can reinforce the hand touch. And so then everybody's happy, right? So we've stopped, interrupted the mistake, we've ask them to do something simple that they can do correctly so that we can reinforce them. So we have something they can reinforce, because after all, they did make a mistake. We can't reinforce that. And then we go back and we set the dog up to try again. So how does that work? Well, this often doesn't work as expected. Because first of all, our dog still knows there's something wrong. They know that, hey, wait a second, I was like in full momentum forward, and now I am stopped and sitting and going back and repeating something that I just thought I did correctly. And so a lot of dogs will start to figure out when this happens that they just know that they've done something wrong. And you'll see when if your dog has put two and two together, what happens is you'll start to see arousal behaviors. You will start to see the dog stress up or stress low. So often what I see in training when I see people do this strategy is that you'll have a dog who then starts to get really sticky. They start to lose their precision, or they start to, they might shut down, they might start to quit, or they go the opposite end of the spectrum and they get really revved up. They might start to do some victory laps. They might start to go, get the zoomies. They might get all silly and jump all over you. Now, it's very important to understand, these are all fight-flight responses. The zoomies is a flight response. Jumping on you is a fawning response. Getting really slow and sticky is a freeze response. Some dogs will like bite or bark. Those are fight responses. All of these are responses of over arousal. You've tipped your dog into a state of over arousal, and that triggers all of those behaviors. Why does that happen? Because the dog is stressed, because the dog understands that they've done something wrong and they don't understand what. And so they get very confused, and then they have these confusion reactions. So in order for this strategy of stopping to be correct, to be effective, we would need to stop at the moment of decision. The moment the dog decides in their head they're taking the front side instead of the back side of the jump, we need to stop there. And I can guarantee you that the vast majority of us do not have that perceptive timing and ability to do that. And so what ends up happening is we stop after the dog has done something, and they don't know what it is that they did wrong. So again, this creates a lot of confusion. This creates a negative conditioned emotion response to the work, and it can lead to things like poison cues. Again, we also are, because we're stopping after the dog has done, they've completed the jump or they've completed something, and they've actually, any behavior is very complex. So you end up with, it's actually a huge behavior chain that you just interrupted, and the dog doesn't understand at what point in the chain things went wrong. So the dog doesn't know what they did wrong. They don't learn how to be correct, and then often people go back and set themselves up to keep going, but they are repeating from a different place. It leads you out of position, and it really doesn't teach you or your dog anything. So the other thing is that it pulls your dog out of flow, pulls you out of flow. And like I said, it creates arousal problems at both ends of the leash, because you feel like, you'll get stressed as well when this happens. And then the other thing that's really, really important, we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but it teaches us to stop when things go wrong. And if you're in dog sports, you'll eventually compete. And when we compete, we don't want to stop in the middle of a run. There are reasons for stopping. For instance, if your dog goes into a state of over-arousal and you need to bring your dog back into optimal arousal. If you lose your place in what's going on and you need to reorient. Those are reasons that we need to stop. We need to kind of gather ourselves. But generally speaking, if you're running an agility course and your dog takes the front side instead of the back side of the jump, you've got an error. If you stop and go back, it becomes training in the ring. And again, your dog isn't actually learning anything, and you're both teaching yourselves to just abort whenever you have a mistake. Instead of learning how to work with mistakes, just keep going. And you might be able to save your run. That one error might not be the end of the world. But if you're so trained to stop every time something goes wrong, then what happens is you will throw that run right out the window. Let me share a quick example. I was at a trial a number of years ago where it was a sheepdog trial, and the dog the sheep broke away from the dog and ran over a hill, and the dog went after the sheep. And as a spectator and the handler at the post, we couldn't see where the dog or the sheep were. They were just all gone. And she kept calling her dog and calling her dog and calling her dog, and and nothing was happening for what felt like forever. It was probably 30, 40 seconds, but it felt like hours. And I'm sure it must have to her at the post. However, while most people would have just given up and left and quit and went and got their dog and ended their run, she did not. Because she trained to never give up. She trained to keep going and push through mistakes and pull together things when they fall apart. And that was how she and her dog worked as a team. And so she just stood there at the post, because you're not allowed to leave the post, and she kept cueing her dog and whistling away, even though the dog was out of sight. And then all of a sudden, the dog comes over the hill with the sheep and brings them back. And she carries on, and she ends up placing with that run and able to go on to the next level. So this is why, from a competition perspective, this is also really important. We do not want to develop a habit of just aborting what we're doing when we encounter a mistake. We want to learn how to work through them, work with them, stay in flow, keep going. So this is a very important strategy to reconsider. All right, next, let's talk about no reward markers. First of all, what is a no reward marker? A no reward marker is a signal that lets the dog know that no reinforcement is coming. The idea is that it's supposed to be an extinction signal. So extinction is the condition where reinforcement is just not coming. And most people try to make this a neutral signal. So we go, oops, uh-oh, whoops. Try again. We're like all happy with our voices, and we think, oh, it's just, our dogs don't mind, except that they do. So for example, and this is where I see the no reward marker used constantly and very ineffectively, is when the dog pops out of weave poles. So your dog starts to weave, gets partially through the poles, and then pops out, or misses a pole, and then people stop, right? And they say, "Uh-oh," and then they send their dog back and start over again. So once again, we're teaching the idea of stopping and interrupting the flow, but we're also, in this case, having teaching the dog to expect a punisher when we say that. So how is it a punisher? So the dog is expecting their reinforcer, and we are, first of all, they're not getting their reinforcer. So at the very least, we are taking away something with the idea of trying to reduce behavior. So which becomes, so then the no reward marker becomes an aversive, but we're actually adding something in. We're adding in that sound. Uh-oh, whoops, try again, right? That becomes something that we are using, we are adding to the situation to reduce the behavior of popping out of the weave poles or whatever it is that you're trying to get your dog to stop doing. So it is effectively a positive punisher. It might be a mild punisher, but it is still, that's how it actually works. And so what ends up happening is we, again, trigger an arousal response. It creates frustration, can create aggression. And so think about it. So as I said, it's supposed to be an extinction signal saying reinforcement's not coming. But let's say you walk up to a vending machine. You might be familiar with this analogy. You walk up to a vending machine and you put money in the vending machine, and then you press on the button and a little red light flashes that says that the machine is out of order and it just ate your money and you're not getting your candy. And so what happens then? Our frustration level spikes, right? I'm sure this has happened to most of us, where we put money into a machine and you push the button and nothing comes out. And so what do? Well, with extinction behavior, what tends to happen with extinction, what happens is we tend to repeat the behavior that we just did with more enthusiasm and intensity. So we'll start like pounding on the button, pushing hard. And then what happens? Well, the candy still doesn't come out. We get more frustrated. We might hit the machine. And then eventually we just turn around and leave in a grumpy mood. And so this is what we do with our dogs. Now, dogs are very accepting of humans in their work together. So we can sometimes get away with this without having a whole lot of fallout, but I still see a lot of it. So when the dog's going through the weave poles, to stick with that example, and we give them a no reward marker, what we're going to see is a dog who is either going to stress up because they're getting frustrated. We're going to see some aggression. We're going to see, barking, and, some dogs will bite their handler. We might see that stress low behavior where they get really slow, they get really sticky, and so on. So if you think about it, if you were trying to do something and every time you made a mistake, you had a bzz buzzer, it starts to get really grating and aggravating. And one thing that's really important to understand is that it's extremely difficult to use punishment effectively. I know that that's not what we're thinking when we are using the no reward marker. We think we're using this gentle, just little redirect. But like I said, from the quadrants perspective, it is actually P+. And it is very hard to use punishment effectively. At the end of this presentation, I have some additional resources, including a fantastic video called The 8 Rules of Punishment by Steve White. I strongly recommend you watch it if you haven't seen it before. And if you have, it's always good to get a refresher. I watch it pretty regularly because it's just such an insightful short video. So understanding that using a no reward marker to try and teach our dogs what to do is counterproductive, because we can't reinforce what they're not, we can't tell them what not to do. The dog just doesn't understand, especially in a complex behavior like weave poles. Like the dog's like, I don't know what I just did wrong. Again, just like the first example of how we handle errors by stopping and asking for something simple for them to do, stopping and telling them they're not getting a reinforcer at all, is the next level of creating a frustrated and confused dog. Interestingly, I was reading some articles and research for this presentation, and I've linked it to it here and a couple more in the resources section, but they did an experiment. Ken Ramirez did an experiment when he was working at Shed Aquarium where he was doing a training workshop with a bunch of humans, and then he had the humans training other humans using positive reinforcement and a no reward marker as a combination, just to show them what it was like. And I'll just give you a quick aside here. If you've never worked as a clicker, like clicker trained, you don't have to use a clicker, but just the method of training with a human rather than a dog, and then been on the receiving end where someone is clicker training you, absolutely importantly do it. It is the most incredibly insightful and powerful experience, is to be on the other end of that clicker, to be on the receiving end of somebody trying to shape you to do a behavior without any verbal instruction, and just a clicker and some, M&Ms or something as reward. That will give you so much compassion and insight and understanding into what your dog is experiencing. And this is where a lot of I went through a workshop like this, and that's where I gained a lot of the insight that I'm sharing with you here. So in this experiment that Ken Ramirez did, what they found was that every single learner in the workshop experienced frustration and even occasional aggression, sometimes veiled as jokes and sometimes not. About half of the learners never even completed the task in the allotted time, while they had been highly successful in other games. So this is what happens when they add in the no reward marker. And then the article goes on, and again, you can read it on your own, to say that it was that they considered that particular session a success because it was the first time that Ken ever did this experiment where at least one person didn't storm out of the room. So you can see how much frustration it creates in humans, and just imagine with our dogs. But our dogs don't have that agency. So some of them will act out, but a lot of them just get really slow and frustrated and discouraged. And we don't want that. I know that's not what any of us wants. Okay, finally, the third standard approach that I see with handling errors is using a low value versus a high value differentiator when we're training. So for example, the dog is doing a behavior, we're teaching them, and we might use kibble. Okay, you try and you get the kibble for any effort. And then the dog does the behavior we actually want, and we give them cheese. And the idea is that they get reinforced for everything that they want to do, everything that they're doing. So we're maintaining a nice high rate of reinforcement, which I think is great. However, we want to extra reinforce the behavior that we want to grow. And that can still be a bit tricky. It can work in some instances, but it can also create confusion. So let's give an example that you might be able to relate to. Let's say you show up to work and your boss asks you to do a particular task, and you do the task and you get $10. And the next day you show up to work and then you get asked to do a particular task, and you're the same task again, and you do it, and then you get $10. And this goes on for 2 or 3 days in a row. And then one day you come in, you get asked to do the task, you do the task again, and you get $100. And you're like, wow, sweet, that was awesome. I was liking the $10 every time I did this, but ooh, now I got $100. That was amazing. And then the next day you come into work and you do the task again, and you get $10. And you're like, dude, you gave me $100 yesterday. Why am I only getting 10 today? I'm confused. And then you're like, now that I know that can pay $100, why would I do it for 10? So think about that. Is using a jackpot motivating, or could it be discouraging? Does it add clarity, or does it create confusion? Well, it depends on if you understand why you got that $100 instead of just 10. Do you have that clarity in your training? If you do that $100, if you give that jackpot and your dog does the exact same behavior to get the jackpot again. If the dog is able to repeat the jackpot behavior, then you know that was clear. But that's not what I see a lot of the time. Because often, again, our timing is not perfect. So anything that our dogs are doing, we think, let's say you ask your dog to sit, we think that's one behavior, but it's not really. It's a whole chain of behaviors. It's, all the muscles that are engaging to bend that back end and fold it down and move the tail out of the way and maybe shuffle some feet to get everything into the right position. And sometimes they sit, a little bit crooked, and sometimes they sit more straight. And let's say we want a jackpot for the straight sit, but does the dog know that they're actually being jackpotted for the straight sit? Or in their mind is a sit, a sit, a sit, and a sit, and a sit, and a sit. So until we can give them that clarity, then jackpotting is potentially going to create confusion. And then it's going to create discouragement when they don't get the jackpot the next time they try it. They're going to be a little bit disappointed that they're not getting that cheese or that $100. So this approach, once again, is going to potentially create some fallout. And the whole thing we're trying to do is avoid the fallout, give clarity to our training, and help our dogs be correct. Okay, I want to shift gears now and ask a very interesting question. Why do our dogs need to know they're wrong? We put so much effort into letting them know that they are wrong. We're trying to, everything that I just shared with you was our standard approaches to explaining to our dogs, hey, you made a mistake. Because we think that they need to know that they're wrong. So why do they need to know they're wrong? Well, I came up with 3 categories of reasons that I am concluding that we feel the need to share with them that they're wrong. The first one is that we believe that if they know they're wrong, that will help them know what's right. Next, and this is where we get into a little bit of maybe a hot button topic here. If the dog is wrong, then the problem is not us. And finally, our social programming has a huge impact here. So let's unpack each of these one at a time. Okay, so the first one, and I think this is probably the most popular reason that most people are going to say that dogs need to know that they're wrong, is that it helps them learn how to be correct. And I want to say that experiencing errors and even frustration actually can help with learning. There's a great podcast, again, I put it in the resources section, a Huberman podcast, that talks about how errors can help with learning. And it's very convincing, and I've been convinced that this is actually true. Errors can help with learning, but here's the crux of the matter. Errors can help with learning when you know what the correct behavior is. So for instance, and this is the example that Huberman uses in his podcast. If you are shooting hoops, probably, most of you know what that's like, to pick up a ball and throw it through a hoop of some sort, or toss a scrunched up piece of paper into a trash can. And so we've probably all done this. And so you can relate to the feeling. So you pick up the scrunched up ball of paper and you toss it into a trash can, or you take your basketball and you toss it into the hoop, and you miss. So that's an error. Here's the difference. We know what the correct end result is supposed to look like. We know that the correct end result is the paper in the trash can or the ball through the hoop. And so when we make that error, what our brain does is it maps out how to get closer the next time. I was at a party the other day where we played, and maybe you've seen this game. It's called Minute to Win It. And there were all these games, and they're all about these little coordination games where you're like throwing ping pong balls at things and so on, and it's under time, and you're repeating the task over and over and over again. So what I found was that, so this is a perfect example of, I knew what the end result was supposed to look like. So for example, I had a plastic cup, and it was upside down on the table, and I'd put it over the edge of the table, so the lip's sticking out a little bit over the edge, and then my fingers go under it, and I'm supposed to flip it, and it's supposed to spin in the air and land. And if it landed on its end, I would win an opportunity to do the next step. And then you would repeat this, and you had 2 minutes, and you would just do this over and over again. So the first bunch of times I kept flipping the cup and it would land on its side, flipping the cup and landing on its side. It seemed really hard. And I couldn't tell you how to actually get the cup. I didn't know how to get the cup to land on its end. However, after maybe half a dozen tries, I accidentally did it right, and the cup landed. And my nervous system felt that correctness. And when I tried again, I missed a couple more times, and then I got it again after maybe 3 more times. And I kept going. And by the end of my 2 minutes, I could do it almost, I would probably say 75 to 80% of the time correctly. I still couldn't tell you exactly how I did it. I had to feel it. But what I knew was what the correct end result looked like. And so with every iteration, my nervous system, my body, my brain just automatically readjusted, tweaked a little bit, got it right. Our dogs will do this when they're jumping, for instance, and they're learning how to move their bodies over a bar, and they like that's a developed skill. And the more they do it, the more their bodies sort of learn how to jump the bar without taking a lot of air, without clipping the bar, and so on. And again, that's this practice. A lot of dogs will intrinsically know that, or just dislike the feeling of touching the bar. So they will learn, they know that once they understand, and not all dogs do, once they understand that the idea is to keep the bar up, then they can adjust their body to keep the bar up. And so that then knocking the bar is feedback that helps them learn how to not knock the bar, because they know what the end goal is. So if we are teaching a behavior where it makes sense to the animal, to the dog, what is expected, then making mistakes can actually lead to learning. I see this all the time in sheepdog training, because that's my primary area of focus for training. And when I can set the dog up to be correct, it's built into their system. A lot of dogs, if they're working bred and they have strong natural instincts, which is not all dogs, but the ones that do, you can see when they get something correct, when they hit that balance point, when they turn that U back, and they do it correctly, you can see they go, oh, that felt right. And then they can repeat it. But they need to know what is correct. And that's where we get into trouble, when we think that they need to experience, that they need to know that they're wrong to help them learn that they're right. The only way that's going to help is if they understand what's right. And a lot of what we train is not natural for them to know what's right. They don't have that clear picture. And so when we tell them they're wrong, they get confused. And so in sum, the reason that telling them that they're wrong is often not going to work, more often than not going to work, is because, again, the dog needs to know what is correct. And especially when we're in the early stages of training, they don't know what's right. Even when you're working with instinct, they still need help to know what's right. And especially doing sports like dog agility, rally obedience in general, where it's entirely human construction. Herding, scent work, retrieval work, gun dog work, protection work, those are jobs where the dog is working with instinct, and that can sometimes be easier, not always, but sometimes be easier for the dog to understand what the end purpose is. Show your dog a set of weave poles, they have no idea what the purpose of that is. We have to be very careful to explain it to them and teach it to them and let them know what's right. Same with contacts. Totally abstract concept for a dog, right? So they don't know what the correct result is supposed to look like. And if we tell them they're wrong, then they can just end up going into arousal, quitting, getting upset. Okay. And the other thing, and this is where I'm just giving you a little hint of where we're going with this. If your dog knew what was right, he would probably have already done it, if he could. Now, sometimes they physically can't because they're still developing the skills, but he would certainly try. That is an assumption that I make 100% of the time, that my dog is always trying to be correct. And so if my dog understood how to be right, he would be right. So when he doesn't do the right thing, I don't assume that telling him he's wrong is going to be helpful, because he will be trying to do what's right to the best of his ability.